Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. My name is Thiago. I'm from Riverside, California, and I'm going to tell you about something that happened to me when I was a child. I remember it as if it were yesterday. In the old house where I lived as a child, my father and I slept in a large screened-in sleeping porch where there was room for 2 beds. I slept in one and he in the other. On many of those nights when I went to sleep, something invisible would come and grab the edge of my bed and shake it with tremendous violence. I had to hold on very tightly so I wouldn't fall out of bed. I would scream in fear and terror. During these times, my father would wake up to my screams of panic and immediately run outside to see what it was. I would run after him in great fear. We would look around and there was nothing there. Remember that our sleeping porch was completely enclosed with thick screening. You couldn't see anything outside from inside, and whoever was outside couldn't see who was inside either. This happened repeatedly. Many times I would wake up with my bed shaking in a very violent way, as if there were a very large, strong person shaking it from outside. Later, we moved to live with my mother in the countryside by the Kern River, where we still have that property today. In this rural area where I went to live, it was my brother who began to see these monsters. He would wake up at night screaming my name at the top of his lungs. He said he saw demons attacking him. Once he told me that he clearly saw, while awake, a demon climbing the stairs of our old house. This demon had a hump on its back, no neck, and its head was like it was just stuck into the body without a neck. After that, I joined the church and learned that these things really are demons, and I learned to deal with them by calling on the blood of Jesus. When they came to disturb me, I would say, "The blood of Jesus has power," and they would run away. My mother taught me to say this. She told me, "When these evil creatures appear, say that." I saw more things, especially when I entered the church. Through visions, I saw these creatures clearly, and I also saw the angels of God battling against them. After some time in the church, I began to see black shadows walking in the darkness, especially when we were in prayer vigils. I saw many times some people there tell what they saw, but I didn't see anything. Then I began to pray asking to see as well, and I started seeing shadows in the darkness. I felt a lot of fear when I saw this. I saw many things, but I'm going to tell you about something that happened to me that was very different, something I'll never forget. Once I was praying behind my house in the backyard. When I raised my head, I saw a very black and hairy man. He reminded me of a werewolf from a movie. At that moment, I was filled with such fear that I became immobile, unable to move. That thing spoke with a horrible, hoarse voice that gives me chills just remembering it. "If you don't stop bothering us and quit this praying, I'm going to destroy your life and kill you. You're burning us and disturbing us greatly." Then I responded, "The power of the blood of Jesus." And I began to pray, asking God to deliver me from that monster. When I looked again, it had disappeared. I don't know where it went. I don't know if it vanished or ran away. I don't even know how it got there without me hearing it. But just as it appeared, after I closed my eyes to pray asking for deliverance, it was gone. I saw many other things, even worse than this, but this one stayed etched in my head. It must have been because it was the first time I witnessed something like this. Among the other things that happened later, I can't say if they were spirits or some other kind of entity, but I was very frightened. This was my experience. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. My name is Sarah, and I live in Portland, Oregon. I'm 31 years old now, but what I'm about to tell you happened when I was 29 in the summer of 2023. It's something I've never been able to fully explain, and frankly, I'm not sure I want to. I work for a medical supply company that distributes vaccines to rural clinics throughout the Pacific Northwest. My job requires me to travel extensively by car, visiting small towns and remote medical facilities to assess their needs and deliver supplies. Most of these places don't have reliable phone service, and the doctors are often too busy to take calls anyway, so personal visits are essential. I had been in this position for about 4 or 5 months and was still adjusting to the long drives. The constant sitting made my back ache, and I wasn't used to spending so much time alone on unfamiliar roads. The incident happened on a Thursday in late July. I was supposed to make a 2-hour drive to a small town in eastern Oregon to visit a clinic there. I had left Portland at 4 in the afternoon, planning to arrive by 6, but a multi-car accident on the interstate held me up in traffic until nearly 6:30. By the time I was finally approaching my destination, it was after 8 o'clock, and the summer sun was beginning to set behind the mountains. I had booked a room at a small motel and was looking forward to getting there. But according to my GPS, I still had about 15 minutes of driving ahead of me. I was listening to a true crime podcast when suddenly the audio cut out and my phone screen went black. Thinking my phone had died for some reason, I tried to restart it with the power button. It turned on immediately, but when I tried to open Google Maps again, something strange happened. The map was completely blank, just a gray screen with the blue arrow indicating my position floating in the middle of nothing. No roads, no landmarks, nothing. I pulled over as soon as I could and checked my signal strength. I still had full bars and internet connectivity. I looked around and saw a few houses in the distance, but otherwise there was nothing. This made me nervous since it was my first time driving to this particular town, and I didn't know the route well. The roads in this area weren't well marked either, so getting lost would have been easy. After a moment, the GPS signal returned. I looked around, started driving straight, and when the app told me to turn right at an intersection that branched off from the main highway, I followed its directions, even though it seemed odd. The turn led me down a narrow street lit by a single streetlight. Further ahead, there were a few houses, and in front of one of them, 2 children were playing with a ball in complete silence. I drove past the houses and continued for about 10 minutes on a straight, unlit road until, and I swear this is true, I somehow ended up back on the main highway. I can't explain how I felt in that moment. There had been no curves, no turns, just a straight road that somehow led me in a complete circle back to where I'd started. The GPS indicated that I needed to turn right again and continue on the highway. I followed the directions reluctantly and drove for about 5 minutes until I found myself at that same intersection again. The app was telling me to turn right once more. I stopped, not knowing what to do. I didn't know how to reach the town, and the map kept directing me to go through that same small neighborhood with those 4 houses. I had no choice since there was no one on the road to ask for directions. I turned right again and drove slowly down that long paved road. I saw the children playing in silence again, and this time they looked back at me, puzzled that I was passing by again. I continued driving for about 15 minutes and felt my heart sink when I saw the highway appear again ahead of me. After driving in a straight line, I had somehow made another complete loop. I parked where I could and got out of the car with my phone. At this point, I was genuinely nervous about what was happening and wanted to see if my signal was working properly. I restarted my phone and walked back and forth across the highway, but no one was coming and I couldn't hear anything, not even the wind. I realized how eerily quiet everything was and ran back to my car. When my phone turned back on, I opened Google Maps and it showed me that same strange route again. I didn't want to go through there again, but I couldn't just stay parked on the highway either. I took a deep breath and decided I would drive straight ahead until I found an open business where I could ask for directions. I continued forward, ignoring when the GPS told me to turn right, and drove for a couple of miles while my phone repeatedly announced that in 500 meters I would find a U-turn. I kept going until suddenly my phone fell silent, and then said that in 300 meters I should turn right. The highway was completely dark now, unlike before. But I immediately recognized the trees, the posts, and the right turn that led to that small neighborhood with the children playing ball. I almost started crying because I thought I was losing my mind. I know it sounds impossible. I'm the first to admit that everything I'm telling you is impossible, but I lived it. Feeling like a complete wreck, I turned right, and as I approached the neighborhood, a woman was standing with the children. I rolled down my window while she looked at me suspiciously. She asked me what was wrong and why I kept driving around the area. Apparently, the children had told her that a car had been circling the neighborhood. She was a middle-aged woman, maybe 40 or 50 years old. I couldn't help but break down crying as I explained that I was lost, that my phone kept directing me to the town, but kept telling me to go through their street over and over, and that no matter which direction I went, I kept ending up back in the same place. To my surprise, she didn't seem surprised or concerned. She just looked back at me with a calm, patient expression until I finished crying. In a serene voice, she said, "This isn't the first time something like this has happened. Don't worry, just turn around and keep going straight on the highway. I don't know why GPS systems malfunction around here." I explained that it wasn't just that I was genuinely driving in circles. And she told me that was normal because there was a U-turn further ahead that looped back to the highway. I shook my head because I had always driven straight, and that's when she became a bit more serious, telling me that was impossible. I imagined she thought I was on drugs or something, and simply insisted that I turn around right there and go back to the highway before going into her house with the children. I didn't know what else to do, so I followed her instructions exactly. I made a U-turn right there and went back to the highway. At this point, and although I don't know exactly why this happened, my phone shut off again. I sighed and simply drove straight ahead without looking at it until several miles later, I saw a gas station in the distance. Beyond it was the town I had been trying to reach. I cried with relief, and 10 minutes later I was at the motel where I had made my reservation. 2 years later, if you ask me what happened, the truth is I have no idea. I don't think this is the reason, but some friends think I might have been hallucinating, or perhaps the stress of being in an unfamiliar area, combined with the darkness of the route, made me think I was driving straight when I was actually taking curves without realizing it. However, I was the only one in that situation, and I'm certain I never took a curve. This is simply inexplicable. Fortunately, nothing like this has ever happened to me again, but I've read online that several people in other parts of the world have experienced similar things. Reality glitches, time loops, call them whatever you want, but it happened to me. I know this story might not be entirely terrifying, since it doesn't involve ghosts or spirits, but it was without a doubt one of the strangest and most confusing moments of my life. Even now, thinking about that endless loop on a dark Oregon highway makes me question what I thought I knew about the nature of reality itself. My name is David, and I've been married to my wife Alina for 23 years. We're very happy together and have lived through many experiences, both good and not so good. But without a doubt, the event I consider the strangest and most terrifying happened during a trip we took to Santa Fe when we celebrated our 5th wedding anniversary. At that time, we hadn't yet had our 2 children, but we knew the moment would come soon. Partly to give a good closure to that stage of our life, we wanted to take a trip to New Mexico, specifically to Santa Fe, where my best friend and his wife were waiting for us. We were undecided about whether to fly or not, but in the end, Alina convinced me that a road trip would be fun, and we'd take advantage of it to stop and eat and visit different places along the way. She was right, so I prepared the car for the trip, had it serviced, and carefully reviewed the route we would follow. To put things in context for anyone who hasn't experienced it, back in 2007, smartphones weren't common at all. In fact, I think the first iPhone had just come out. And although GPS systems existed, I didn't trust them since they had made me get lost on a work trip. And I ended up stranded without gas on the outskirts of a small town in Arizona when I was supposed to arrive in Phoenix. That's why I preferred to rely on my road atlas, and only if absolutely necessary would I ask for directions, though I didn't like that either. You never knew if someone with bad intentions might deliberately mislead you. The plan was simple. Leave Denver at around 4 in the morning, enjoy the trip, stop for breakfast around 8, and enjoy the route to Santa Fe. We would arrive around 3 or 4 at a good pace and without rushing. It was a wonderful trip, and that week of vacation was one of the best of my life. The joke about staying to live there became quite common among the 4 of us, and when we said goodbye, the doors of my friend's house remained open for a future visit. But unfortunately, it was time to return home, and the plan was the same. Leave at 4 or 5 in the morning on Sunday and arrive in Denver around 2 or 3 in the afternoon. Neither Alina nor I had the slightest idea of the strange turn the trip would take. We left Santa Fe via the same route we had followed to get there. The highway was empty but well lit, and Alina was half asleep in the passenger seat. I had music playing at a very low volume, and after a while, I estimate about 20 minutes of driving, I noticed that morning would be quite dark since the sky was cloudy, and you could barely make out small glimmers of dawn. We continued advancing on a lonely highway surrounded by high hills and many trees when suddenly, before reaching a tunnel that I now know is called the Elk Mountain Tunnel, I managed to see a small silhouette moving at full speed in front of the tunnel entrance from left to right. I was coming out of a slight curve surrounded by small hills, so it took me a while to see it, but when I did, I got nervous. In that area, unless it was very well hidden, there shouldn't be any houses. There was a small town further back, but there, in the middle of nowhere next to a tunnel, there shouldn't be anyone, and they surely had bad intentions. Alina reacted to my sudden rigidity and asked me what was wrong. She raised her gaze while I tried to maintain the same speed, and with an apathetic tone of confusion, she said out loud, "What is that old woman doing there?" She saw her better than I did. Even in the darkness, it was an elderly woman standing in the narrow space between the retaining wall and the tunnel entrance, dressed all in black with white hair tied back and a cane in her hands. She was too hunched over, small, and frail for me to believe she was the same one I had seen crossing the highway seconds earlier. I didn't have time to think about stopping or continuing, when suddenly the worst sound I've ever heard in my life occurred, a bang in the engine, and little by little, the car lost power. Alina, now a bit more nervous, asked me what was happening, and I didn't know what to tell her because the car was in excellent condition. But now it was presenting a failure that was forcing me to pull over. This made me very anxious since there was nowhere to park on that narrow stretch of highway. And little by little, we approached that woman with the momentum of the wheels, until the car simply stopped in front of the tunnel entrance, and we were left there, cold, glancing sideways at that pale woman with large eyes and yellow teeth. She slowly approached the window next to Alina, raised one of her fingers, and with a crooked nail tapped the glass saying, "Help me, help me," over and over with a raspy voice that didn't seem natural. I know that told this way, it simply seemed like an elderly woman asking for help early in the morning in a strange place on the road. But what Alina and I felt at that moment was that this woman, this elderly woman who was insistently tapping the glass with her finger, was extremely dangerous. I tried to start the car over and over while the hair on the back of my neck stood up. Alina, meanwhile, told me we had to get out of there, that she wasn't a normal old woman, that she brought something bad with her. But the car was dead, and to the growing terror of that suspicious old woman was added the fact that we were in front of the tunnel entrance, and at any moment a driver could come and cause an accident. I had the safety triangle in the trunk and some cones, but God knows I didn't want to get out with that old woman there. I took a deep breath and told Alina to lower the window a little, just enough to hear her well and be able to respond. Reluctantly, my wife lowered the window a few millimeters, and immediately we felt a terrible smell of putrefaction entering our car while she told us, "Help me, please. I need you to come with me." "My bag fell over there," she said, pointing to the other side of the road where I had seen her coming from running. At that moment, despite the foul smell, I felt for an instant that I was overestimating the situation. Maybe it was just a very strange old lady who lived on the street, but who really needed help. I told her to give me a moment to put up the safety triangle, but she told me to please help her, that it would be quick. Her insistence made me nervous, and for an instant I thought about listening to her. But suddenly, Alina's hand next to mine made me think about how dangerous it was to leave the car like that. I told her to wait for me, and then I got out of the car. Although I got out with an impulse of confidence, as soon as I was outside, I felt like I was walking through a swamp. Each step was difficult, and a freezing cold in my back made me feel over and over that something wasn't right with this situation. My hands were shaking, and it was very difficult for me to open the trunk while that old woman stayed every second next to Alina. I took out the safety triangle and some small cones and backed up to the beginning of the curve, about 30 meters away, to place them. I was running, and when I returned, I saw her where I had left her, staring fixedly and very uncomfortably at Alina. I shouted that I could now help her and to tell me where her bag was so I could help her. A cold breeze laden with that putrefaction smell enveloped me at that moment, while she returned the most bitter look I've felt in my life. The old woman pointed to a space of dirt on the other side of the highway. It was about 5 or maybe 10 meters away. I stayed looking at her, and although standing next to the car I couldn't see Alina, I'm sure she was imploring me to get that old woman away from her. I insisted that she show me where, and this time, annoyed, she told me to follow her. We walked to the edge of the road, and she pointed to the bottom of a ravine, a drop of easily 40 meters to the bottom of a slope. While I had my gaze fixed on that ravine, immediately understanding that this was impossible, and that there probably wasn't any bag down there, I noticed that she wasn't looking down with me, but toward the highway, toward the car, as if she was waiting for something. Everything happened in a fraction of seconds. Suddenly, I heard the loud screech of brakes, and about 30 meters away, a freight truck stopped abruptly right in front of the cones and safety triangle. The putrefaction smell and the cold air intensified, and I, relieved and at the same time panicking, saw that woman cross her arms. I apologized and told her I wouldn't be able to rescue her bag before running back to the car to meet the trucker who had gotten out of his vehicle to ask me what was wrong. I realized that he could also smell that strange and putrid odor, and when I told him I had a breakdown, that trucker, somewhat older, glanced sideways at the old woman and told me that if I wanted, he would tow me to the other side of the tunnel or to a place where I could pull over safely. I thanked him since I really wanted to get out of that strange situation, and in a matter of a few minutes, I had tied a thick rope to my bumper and another to the back of his truck. The whole time until we left there, the old woman kept watching us, gripping the cane tightly in her decrepit hands and looking especially at Alina, who never got out of the car. As we moved through the tunnel in silence, I looked in the rear-view mirror, and that old woman stopped in the middle of the highway to watch us until we disappeared around the curve inside the tunnel. I sighed with relief as the rancid smell dissipated, but Alina remained silent. A few miles ahead, we saw an area to pull over, and the trucker parked there too with a gesture of relief. "Thank God you put up those cones and the triangle. I never would have seen them in that curve," he commented to me with a calm tone while I opened the hood of my car. At that moment, I thought about how insistent she had been that I first go rescue her bag, and I felt like the air was leaving me as I thought that that was her true intention. To get me away from the car without me putting up the safety triangle. We checked quickly, but nothing seemed to be wrong. I got in the car, and on the first try, the car started. It didn't make sense. Finally, Alina broke the silence. It was her. She stopped the car. "Let's get out of here." I'm ashamed to admit that only at that moment did I realize that Alina was crying, in a state of shock. The trucker told me that we all saved ourselves from something horrible that morning and wished us both the best before leaving. I apologized to her for leaving her alone, but she told me to just get us as far away from that place as possible. 3 or 4 hours later, when we stopped for breakfast in a town very far away, Alina told me what happened while I was putting up the cones and safety triangle. That old woman started tapping the glass, drawing strange shapes with her finger, and started asking her if she wanted to have children, if she wanted to be a good mother, and things like that. The tone in which she asked it was very uncomfortable, and she felt very scared, so she stopped looking back at her. The putrid smell got stronger, and suddenly the old woman asked her a question that caused Alina true terror. "Do you think he'll have time to break?" "I don't think so." Right at that moment, she realized that the old woman was setting a trap for us, and she turned to look at her angrily. But the anger quickly gave way to fear when she saw that the old woman's skin was peeling and sinking, as if the flesh was falling off her body. Alina didn't even have time to scream before she was left breathless, terrified by the supernatural image that was in front of her. It was at that moment that I called the old woman to show me where the bag was, and that's why she was so annoyed that I interrupted her. Obviously, she was very busy tormenting my wife. The intentions of that thing became evident. All she was looking for on that lonely and isolated stretch of highway was to cause an accident, and the more victims, the better. But apparently, she had a special hatred for Alina. Over time, we have returned to Santa Fe, and nothing even remotely similar has happened to us. But whenever we cross that tunnel, we remember the encounter we had with an entity that blatantly tried to end our lives. It all started on a Tuesday night in my downtown Chicago apartment. I had just finished a long shift at the marketing firm where I worked, and like every night for the past 3 years, I went through my usual routine. After grabbing a quick dinner from the Thai place downstairs, I headed to my bathroom to brush my teeth and wash my face before bed. My bathroom was small but functional, with a large mirror mounted above the sink that I'd inherited from the previous tenant. As I approached the mirror to splash some cold water on my face, I caught something in my peripheral vision. A quick, dark shadow that seemed to dart across the reflection. When I looked directly at the mirror, nothing was there except my own tired face staring back at me. I rubbed my eyes, thinking it was just fatigue from staring at computer screens all day. After all, I'd been pulling 12-hour days lately, trying to land a promotion. I finished my routine and headed to bed, dismissing the incident as nothing more than my overworked mind playing tricks on me. But the shadow returned the next night, and the night after that. Every evening as I approached the bathroom mirror, I'd catch a glimpse of something moving just at the edge of the reflection. It was always fleeting, always just out of direct sight, but undeniably there. The shape seemed human-like, tall and thin, but whenever I turned to look directly, it would vanish instantly. After a week of these encounters, I started feeling genuinely unsettled. The comfortable routine of my evening ritual had become a source of anxiety. I found myself hesitating before entering the bathroom, my heart rate quickening as I approached the mirror. Sleep became elusive as I lay in bed wondering what exactly I was seeing, or if I was losing my mind. I tried everything I could think of to rationalize it. Maybe it was a reflection from the street lights outside bouncing off the window. Perhaps shadows from passing cars were creating the illusion. I even considered that the building's old plumbing might be causing vibrations that made the mirror shift slightly. But deep down, I knew none of these explanations felt right. 2 weeks into this strange phenomenon, I decided to confront whatever was happening head-on. Instead of my usual quick routine, I stood in front of the mirror for several minutes, watching and waiting. The bathroom was completely still, lit only by the harsh fluorescent light above. That's when I saw it clearly for the first time. The figure materialized slowly in the reflection, standing directly behind me. It was the silhouette of a man, tall and gaunt, wearing what appeared to be an old-fashioned suit. His face was obscured by shadow, but I could see the hollow sockets where his eyes should have been. He stood perfectly still, as if he'd been waiting for me to finally notice him. My blood ran cold, but something kept me from turning around. In the mirror, I watched as the figure raised one skeletal hand and pointed directly at my reflection. His mouth opened as if he was trying to speak, but no sound came out. The temperature in the bathroom seemed to drop 10 degrees in an instant. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself. "What do you want from me?" The figure's mouth continued moving soundlessly, his pointing gesture becoming more urgent. There was something desperate about his movements, as if he was trying to communicate something critically important. I felt a strange mix of terror and pity wash over me. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. The mirror showed only my own pale, frightened face and the empty bathroom behind me. I stood there for what felt like hours, waiting for him to return, but the reflection remained normal. When I finally worked up the courage to turn around, the bathroom was exactly as it should be, empty, except for me. From that night forward, the figure appeared every time I looked in the mirror. He never spoke, never made any sound, but his desperate gestures became more frantic with each encounter. I tried covering the mirror with a towel, but somehow I could still sense his presence behind the fabric. I considered smashing the mirror entirely, but something held me back, a growing feeling that he needed my help. I started researching the history of my building, digging through city records and old newspaper archives. What I discovered chilled me to the bone. In 1947, a man named Thomas Whitmore had lived in my exact apartment. He was found dead in the bathroom, having suffered a heart attack while getting ready for work. The strangest part was that witnesses said he'd been trying to write something on the mirror with soap, but the message was never deciphered. The description of Thomas Whitmore matched the figure I'd been seeing: perfectly tall, thin, always impeccably dressed in the style of the 40s. Now, 3 months later, Thomas still appears in my mirror every night. I've grown accustomed to his presence, though I still don't understand what he's trying to tell me. Sometimes I catch him during the day too, flickering in the reflection of my computer screen or in storefront windows as I walk to work. I've stopped trying to make him go away. Instead, I find myself looking forward to our silent encounters, wondering if someday I'll finally understand what Thomas Whitmore is so desperately trying to communicate from whatever realm exists beyond the glass. The mystery haunts me, but it's become a part of my life now. A ghostly reminder that some things in this world will forever remain unexplained, lingering just beyond our ability to fully comprehend them. My name is Peter, and I've always been drawn to the wilderness. Living in Portland, Oregon, I'm surrounded by some of the most beautiful hiking trails in the country, and I make it a point to explore them every weekend. There's something about the silence of the forest that helps me clear my head after a stressful week working as a software engineer. On a crisp Saturday morning in late October, I decided to venture into the Mount Hood National Forest, specifically a lesser-known trail that my coworker Jake had mentioned. He told me about a secluded path that wound deep into old-growth pine forest, far from the tourist crowds that usually populate the more famous trails. The idea of complete solitude appealed to me, so I packed my gear and drove the hour and a half to the trailhead. The beginning of the hike was exactly what I'd hoped for. Towering Douglas firs and western hemlocks created a natural cathedral above me, their branches filtering the morning sunlight into scattered golden beams. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the earthy scent of pine needles and moss. Birds chirped overhead, and occasionally I'd hear the distant rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. For the first 2 hours, everything was perfect. I followed the narrow trail as it wound deeper into the forest, taking photos of particularly beautiful spots and enjoying the meditative rhythm of walking. The path was well marked, with occasional blue blazes painted on trees, though I hadn't seen another hiker since leaving my car. It was around noon when I first noticed something was off. I had stopped to eat lunch beside a small creek when I heard what sounded like whispered conversations coming from somewhere behind me. The voices were too distant to make out individual words, but there was definitely a back-and-forth quality to them, as if multiple people were having a quiet discussion. I turned around, expecting to see other hikers approaching, but the trail behind me was empty. I called out a friendly hello, thinking maybe they were just out of sight around a bend, but my voice seemed to be swallowed by the forest. The whispers stopped immediately, leaving only the sound of the creek babbling beside me. After finishing my sandwich, I continued hiking, but now I was more aware of the sounds around me. Every 15 or 20 minutes, I'd hear the whispers again, sometimes seeming to come from my left, sometimes from my right, always just at the edge of my hearing. When I'd stop to listen more carefully, they would fade away, leaving me questioning whether I'd heard anything at all. Then I started hearing footsteps. At first, they seemed to match my own pace perfectly, which made sense. Maybe it was just the echo of my boots on the forest floor bouncing off the trees. But when I experimented by stopping suddenly or changing my rhythm, the footsteps continued for a few beats before stopping as well. It was as if someone was following me, but trying to stay hidden just out of sight. My rational mind tried to find explanations. Perhaps it was another hiker who was shy about making contact, or maybe sounds were carrying strangely through the dense forest. But as the afternoon wore on and the phenomena continued, a growing sense of unease began to creep over me. The whispers became more frequent and seemed closer. Sometimes I could swear I heard my name being called, though so softly I couldn't be completely sure. The footsteps behind me grew more distinct, and occasionally I thought I could hear the snap of twigs and the rustle of leaves, as if something large was moving parallel to the trail, but staying hidden in the trees. By 3 o'clock, what had started as mild curiosity had transformed into genuine concern. The forest, which had felt welcoming and peaceful that morning, now seemed to press in around me with an almost oppressive presence. The canopy above blocked out more light than I remembered, casting everything in a greenish twilight that made it difficult to see very far in any direction. I decided it was time to turn back, but when I looked behind me, I realized with a jolt of panic that I couldn't see any blue blazes marking the trail I'd been following. Somehow, without noticing, I had wandered off the main path and onto what appeared to be an old, overgrown deer track. The whispers seemed to sense my confusion and grew louder, more insistent. Now I could definitely hear multiple voices, though they spoke in a language I didn't recognize, or perhaps weren't speaking at all, but making sounds that just resembled human speech. The footsteps were no longer trying to be stealthy. I could hear heavy boots or hooves crashing through the underbrush on both sides of me. I pulled out my phone to check my GPS, but I had no signal. The battery was also nearly dead, though I was certain it had been fully charged that morning. Fighting down a surge of panic, I tried to retrace my steps, looking for any familiar landmarks that might guide me back to the main trail. That's when I saw the figure. About 50 yards ahead of me, standing motionless between two enormous pine trees, was the silhouette of a man. He was too far away to make out details, but something about his posture and the way he stood perfectly still made my skin crawl. He wasn't wearing hiking gear. His outlines suggested old-fashioned clothing, maybe a long coat or cloak. I stopped walking and called out, "Hey, can you help me? I think I'm lost." The figure didn't respond or move. Instead, the whispers around me suddenly stopped, creating an unnatural silence that was somehow more frightening than the strange sounds had been. Even the birds had gone quiet. Slowly, the figure began to move toward me. His gait was wrong, somehow too smooth, as if he was gliding rather than walking. As he got closer, I could see that his face was obscured by shadow, and his movements had an otherworldly quality that made every instinct in my body scream at me to run. I didn't need any more encouragement. I turned and ran as fast as I could through the forest, crashing through ferns and jumping over fallen logs, branches tearing at my jacket and scratching my face. Behind me, I could hear the sounds of pursuit, not just from the figure, but from multiple sources, as if the entire forest had come alive and was chasing me. The whispers returned, but now they were louder and more aggressive, seeming to come from every direction at once. They rose to an almost deafening crescendo that felt like it was pressing against my eardrums. I ran blindly, no longer caring about finding the trail, focused only on getting away from whatever was hunting me through those ancient trees. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I burst through a line of trees and found myself in a small clearing. In the center stood an old, weathered sign that read, "Mount Hood National Forest, Salmon River Trail." I had somehow made it back to civilization. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, and I didn't slow down driving until I was back in Portland, with the city lights all around me. It wasn't until I was safely in my apartment that I realized my phone was working again and showed full battery life. I never did find out what happened to me in those woods. I've researched the area extensively and found stories going back to the 1800s of hikers reporting similar experiences, whispers, in unknown languages. The feeling of being followed, encounters with figures that didn't seem quite human. To this day, I still love hiking, but I stick to the popular, well-traveled trails. Some mysteries of the forest are better left unexplored, and some whispers in the woods are better left unanswered. My name is Caleb, and I've always considered myself a practical, level-headed person. I work as an accountant in downtown Minneapolis, live in a modest apartment, and generally keep my life simple and organized. I'm not the type to believe in superstitions or supernatural nonsense. At least, I wasn't until 6 months ago when everything changed. It started with a phone call on a rainy Thursday evening in March. The voice on the other end belonged to a lawyer I'd never heard of, calling to inform me that my great uncle Edmund had passed away. This came as a shock because I barely knew Edmund existed. He was my grandfather's brother, a reclusive man who had lived alone in a sprawling Victorian house in Salem, Massachusetts, for as long as anyone could remember. The lawyer explained that Edmund had left his entire estate to me, apparently because I was his only living relative. The inheritance included the house, its contents, and what the lawyer described as various personal effects and collectibles. It seemed surreal. I was inheriting a fortune from a man I'd met maybe twice in my entire life, both times at family funerals when I was too young to really remember him. 2 weeks later, I took time off work and flew to Salem to see what I'd inherited. The house was even more imposing than I'd imagined, a 3-story Gothic revival mansion with elaborate gingerbread trim and tall, narrow windows that seemed to watch the street like eyes. Inside, it was like stepping back in time. Edmund had been a collector of antiques, and every room was filled with Victorian furniture, old paintings, and curiosities from around the world. I spent my first day just wandering through the rooms, trying to process the magnitude of what I'd inherited. There were Civil War artifacts, Native American pottery, ancient-looking books in languages I couldn't identify, and display cases full of jewelry and coins. It would take months to properly catalog everything. It was in Edmund's study, a wood-paneled room lined with bookshelves, that I found the medallion. It was sitting on his mahogany desk, as if he'd been examining it just before he died. The medallion was unlike anything I'd ever seen, about the size of a silver dollar, but made from a metal that seemed to shift color depending on how the light hit it. Sometimes it appeared bronze, sometimes silver, sometimes almost black. The surface was covered with intricate engravings that looked ancient, depicting symbols and figures that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. When I picked it up, it was surprisingly heavy and warm to the touch, as if it had been sitting in sunlight even though the study was dimly lit. There was something compelling about it, almost hypnotic. I found myself studying the engravings for what felt like hours, trying to decipher their meaning. Eventually, I slipped it into my pocket, telling myself I'd research its origins later. That was my first mistake. The flight back to Minneapolis was delayed 3 times due to mechanical issues, turning what should have been a 4-hour journey into an 11-hour ordeal. When I finally made it home, I discovered that my apartment had been broken into, though strangely, nothing seemed to be missing. The police said it looked like vandalism rather than theft, but something about the random destruction felt personal, almost vindictive. Over the following days, things went from bad to worse with alarming speed. Small mishaps turned into major disasters. I spilled coffee on important client files at work, accidentally deleted crucial spreadsheets, and made calculation errors that I'd never made before in my 15-year career. My supervisor, who had always praised my attention to detail, called me into his office 3 times in 1 week to discuss my performance issues. Then I got sick. It started as just feeling run down, but quickly escalated into the worst flu I'd ever experienced. I spent 4 days in bed with a fever that reached 104 degrees, hallucinating and barely able to keep food down. When I finally dragged myself to the doctor, all my tests came back normal. According to medical science, there was nothing wrong with me. My personal life wasn't faring any better. Sarah, my girlfriend of 2 years, started picking fights over trivial things. Our relationship, which had been stable and comfortable, suddenly became a minefield of arguments and misunderstandings. She accused me of being distant and distracted, which was probably true. I was constantly worried about what disaster would strike next. The final straw came on a Friday afternoon when my supervisor called me into his office and handed me a termination letter. Apparently, the errors I'd been making had cost the firm a major client, and they could no longer afford to keep me on. I was devastated. I'd never been fired from anything in my life, and suddenly I was unemployed with bills piling up and no prospects in sight. That weekend, Sarah and I had our worst fight ever. It started over something insignificant. I think I forgot to pick up groceries, but escalated into a screaming match about everything that had been wrong between us lately. She accused me of becoming a completely different person over the past month, cold and paranoid and impossible to live with. When she stormed out, I knew she wasn't coming back. Sitting alone in my apartment that night, surrounded by the wreckage of my formerly stable life, I finally made the connection. Everything had started going wrong the day I took the medallion from Edmund's house. I pulled it out of my pocket and stared at those shifting, hypnotic engravings, feeling a mix of fear and anger. I tried everything I could think of to get rid of the cursed thing. I threw it in a dumpster behind my building, but when I woke up the next morning, it was sitting on my nightstand. I drove it to a lake outside the city and hurled it as far as I could into the water, watching it disappear beneath the surface. 3 days later, I found it in my kitchen drawer. The medallion seemed determined to stay with me, and every attempt to dispose of it only made my situation worse. After I threw it in the lake, I got food poisoning from a restaurant I'd eaten at dozens of times without incident. When I tried to bury it in a park, my car was towed, and I got a ticket for illegal dumping. It was as if the medallion was punishing me for trying to reject it. I started researching Edmund's collection, hoping to find some clue about the medallion's history. What I discovered in his personal papers made my blood run cold. The medallion had been in our family for generations, passed down through the male line, and every man who'd owned it had met with tragedy. My great-great-grandfather had died in a mysterious fire. His son had been committed to an asylum after claiming he was being tormented by demons. Edmund's own father had disappeared entirely, leaving behind only a note about breaking the chain. Edmund's journals, which I found hidden in a secret compartment of his desk, detailed decades of misfortune that he attributed to the medallion. Lost jobs, failed relationships, mysterious illnesses, financial ruin. The same pattern I was experiencing, repeated over and over. He tried everything to get rid of it, consulting priests, psychics, and scholars of the occult, but nothing worked. The medallion always returned, and the curse always continued. The last entry in his journal, dated just a week before his death, was particularly chilling. I understand now why Father tried to end the line. The medallion doesn't just bring misfortune, it feeds on it. Each generation, it grows stronger, more determined to claim its next victim. I pray that Caleb is wiser than I was. I pray he finds a way to break what I could not. Now, 6 months later, I'm still trapped by the medallion's influence. I'm unemployed, alone, and barely scraping by on what's left of my savings. The inheritance money from Edmund's estate has been tied up in legal complications that seem to multiply every time I try to resolve them. I've lost friends, lost my health, lost any sense of the person I used to be. The medallion sits on my desk as I write this, its surface gleaming with that strange, shifting light. Sometimes I catch it moving slightly when I'm not looking directly at it, as if it's alive and aware. I've stopped trying to get rid of it. I know now that it will never let me go. But I refuse to give up hope entirely. Somewhere in Edmund's vast collection of books and artifacts, there might be an answer. Some way to break a curse that has tormented my family for generations. Until then, I live with the constant weight of knowing that everything I touch turns to ash, and that the medallion will be my companion until the day I die. Or until I find the strength to do what my ancestors could not. The curse may have claimed me, but perhaps I can find a way to ensure it claims no one else. That night in Denver was unlike any I'd experienced before. I had moved to the city just 3 months earlier for a new job at a tech startup, and I was still getting used to living alone in my studio apartment on the 15th floor of a downtown high-rise. The building was modern and supposedly secure, which had been one of the selling points when I'd signed the lease. It was a Tuesday in late November when the first major snowstorm of the season hit Colorado. The Weather Service had been warning about it for days. A massive front moving down from Canada that was expected to bring blizzard conditions and knock out power across the metro area. I'd stocked up on water, flashlights, and batteries, figuring I was as prepared as anyone could be for what Mother Nature was about to unleash. The storm arrived around 6 in the evening with a vengeance. Wind howled around the building with such force that the windows actually flexed inward, and snow fell so heavily that I couldn't see the building across the street. By 8 o'clock, the power was flickering intermittently, and by 9:30 it went out completely, plunging the entire neighborhood into darkness. I wasn't particularly worried at first. The building had backup generators for the emergency lighting in the hallways, and I had my flashlight and phone for illumination. I made myself a peanut butter sandwich for dinner, opened a warm beer from my unpowered refrigerator, and settled in to wait out the storm. Outside, the wind continued its relentless assault, creating an almost musical howling that seemed to penetrate the walls themselves. Around 11 o'clock, I decided to try to get some sleep. The temperature in my apartment had already dropped noticeably without the heating system running, so I piled on extra blankets and climbed into bed. The sounds of the storm were actually somewhat soothing in their consistency. A white noise of wind and snow that should have made it easy to drift off. But sleep wouldn't come. I lay there in the complete darkness, listening to the storm and thinking about work, about my ex-girlfriend back in Phoenix, about whether I'd made the right decision moving to Colorado. The wind seemed to be getting stronger rather than weaker, and occasionally I'd hear what sounded like debris hitting the side of the building. I must have been lying there for over an hour when the atmosphere in the room suddenly changed. It wasn't anything I could see or hear specifically, but there was a shift in the air, a sense that something was different. The temperature seemed to drop even further, and I found myself straining to listen for sounds beyond the storm. That's when I felt it. Something cold and rough grabbed my ankle through the blankets. The sensation was so unexpected and so clearly not imaginary that I literally gasped out loud. Whatever had touched me had a firm grip, and I could feel individual fingers pressing against my skin through the fabric. The touch was ice cold, as if the hand had been sitting in a freezer, and the skin felt wrong, somehow too rough, too dry, almost like leather. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it over the storm. I tried to pull my leg away, but the grip tightened, holding me in place. The rational part of my mind was scrambling for explanations. Maybe I was having a hypnagogic hallucination, that strange state between sleeping and waking where your brain can play tricks on you. But the sensation was too real, too detailed, too persistent to be a dream. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the flashlight app. The grip on my ankle seemed to sense my movement and squeezed tighter, almost painfully. When I finally managed to activate the light and swing it toward the foot of my bed, my breath caught in my throat. There was nothing there. The blankets lay flat and undisturbed exactly as they should. I could see my own feet under the covers, but there was no sign of any hand or any presence that could have been touching me. Yet I could still feel it, those cold, rough fingers wrapped around my ankle with unmistakable pressure. I threw back the blankets and shone the light directly on my leg. My ankle looked completely normal, but I could still feel that icy grip as clearly as if I were looking right at it. It was the most disorienting sensation I'd ever experienced. My eyes telling me one thing, while my nerve endings insisted on something completely different. "What the hell?" I whispered to the empty room, my voice barely audible over the storm. As if responding to my words, the grip suddenly released. The cold sensation vanished instantly, leaving behind only the warm feeling of my own skin under the blankets. I sat there for several minutes, shining the light around the room, checking under the bed, in the closet, anywhere something or someone could have been hiding. The apartment was exactly as it should be, empty except for me. But the feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. If anything, it had intensified. The darkness beyond my phone's small circle of light seemed to press in around me, thick and oppressive. Every shadow looked like it might be hiding something, and every sound from the storm outside took on a sinister quality. I spent the rest of the night sitting up in bed with my back against the wall, phone in hand, too afraid to turn off the light or close my eyes. The presence in the room was undeniable. I could feel eyes watching me from somewhere in the darkness, though I never saw anything that could have been their source. Several times I thought I heard movement, the soft whisper of fabric or the creak of floorboards. But each time I investigated with my light, I found nothing. The storm finally began to subside around 4 in the morning, and the first gray light of dawn started filtering through my windows around 6. Only then did the oppressive feeling begin to lift, as if whatever had been in my apartment was retreating with the darkness. By 7, when the power finally came back on, and my heater kicked in with a reassuring hum, the room felt normal again. I tried to convince myself it had all been in my imagination, a combination of stress, unfamiliar surroundings, and the unsettling effects of the storm. But I couldn't shake the memory of that cold, rough touch, or the absolute certainty that something had been in the room with me. I called in sick to work that day and spent it researching the building's history. What I found didn't help my peace of mind. The high-rise had been built on the site of an old psychiatric hospital that had burned down in 1962. 15 patients and 3 staff members had died in the fire, trapped on the upper floors when the ancient building's wooden stairwells became impassable. Local newspaper archives from the time mentioned strange reports from firefighters and investigators' claims of cold spots in the ruins, the feeling of being touched by invisible hands, and the persistent sensation of being watched, even in broad daylight. The reports had been dismissed as trauma-induced hallucinations, but reading them sent chills down my spine. I never experienced anything quite like that night again, but my apartment never felt completely normal either. Even now, 3 years later, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night with the absolute certainty that someone is in the room with me. I've learned to sleep with a lamp on, and I've never spent another night in complete darkness. The rational part of my mind still insists that what I experienced was some kind of sleep disorder or stress reaction. But late at night, when the wind is howling and the building is creaking around me, I remember that cold, rough grip on my ankle, and I know with absolute certainty that some things in this world can't be explained by logic or science. Sometimes in the darkness, we're not as alone as we think we are. My name is Leonardo, and what I'm about to tell you happened to me in my house in suburban Atlanta, Georgia. I'd been living in the same 2-story colonial for 8 years, ever since my divorce, and I thought I knew every sound the old place made. Every creak of the hardwood floors, every groan of the settling foundation, every rattle of the windows when the wind picked up. But nothing had prepared me for what started happening last October. It began on a Thursday night around 11:30. I was in my living room watching the late news when I heard 3 distinct knocks on my front door. They weren't urgent or aggressive, just a polite rap, the kind a neighbor might make if they needed to borrow something. I muted the television and listened, but there was no follow-up knock or doorbell ring. When I opened the door, there was no one there. The porch light illuminated my entire front yard, and I could see clearly that the street was empty. No cars were driving away, no footsteps echoed in the distance, and none of my neighbors had their lights on. It was as if whoever had knocked had simply vanished into thin air. I stood there for a few minutes, looking up and down the quiet suburban street. The October air was crisp and still, with barely enough breeze to rustle the leaves. I checked my security camera app on my phone, but the footage showed nothing, just me opening the door to an empty porch. Puzzled but not particularly concerned, I locked up and went to bed, chalking it up to teenage pranksters or maybe a delivery driver who'd realized they had the wrong address. But the knocking returned the next night. Same time, same pattern, 3 measured knocks that seemed neither urgent nor casual, just expectant. Again, when I opened the door, there was no one there. This time, I didn't just check the immediate area. I walked around my entire house, looking for any sign of an intruder or prankster. I found nothing. No footprints in the flower beds, no disturbance in the mulch, no evidence that anyone had been on my property at all. By the 3rd night, I was starting to feel genuinely unsettled. The knocks came again at 11:30 on the dot, and this time I was ready. I'd positioned myself by the front window where I could see the porch while staying hidden behind the curtains. I watched and waited, but I never saw anyone approach my door. The knocks just seemed to come from empty air, 3 clear raps against the wood that I could hear plainly from inside. I yanked the door open within seconds of the last knock, fast enough that anyone standing there would still be visible. But the porch was as empty as it had been the previous nights. This time, though, I thought I caught something in my peripheral vision, a dark shape moving away from the door at the edge of my vision. When I turned to look directly, there was nothing there, but I had the distinct feeling that something had been present just moments before. The nightly knocking continued for over a week, and I began to dread 11:30 each evening. The sound had taken on an almost supernatural quality in my mind, too consistent to be random, too persistent to be a prank, too purposeful to be explained away. I started researching everything I could think of. Previous owners of the house, deaths in the neighborhood, local history, anything that might explain what was happening. I learned that my house had been built in 1978 and had only had 3 previous owners before me. The first family had lived there for 15 years without incident. The second owners had stayed for just 2 years, selling quickly after the husband got transferred to another state. But it was the third owner, an elderly man named Walter Henning, who caught my attention. Walter had lived in the house alone for 12 years after his wife died. According to the neighbors I spoke with, he'd become increasingly reclusive in his final years, rarely leaving the house and accepting few visitors. He died of a heart attack in his sleep in 2015, just 6 months before I bought the house. What really got my attention was what my neighbor Mrs. Patterson told me when I asked about Walter. She said that in his final months, he developed what she called peculiar habits. He would stand at his front window every night around 11:30, as if he was waiting for someone. When she asked him about it once, he told her he was expecting an important visitor who always came at that time, though she never saw anyone come or go. Mrs. Patterson also mentioned that Walter had been found with his shoes on and his keys in his hand, as if he'd been about to answer the door when he collapsed. The paramedics said it looked like he'd been trying to get to the front entrance when the heart attack struck. Armed with this information, I decided to approach the situation differently. Instead of immediately opening the door when the knocking came, I would try to communicate first. That night, when the familiar 3 knocks echoed through my house at exactly 11:30, I stood behind the closed door and spoke clearly. "Walter, is that you? What do you need?" The knocking stopped immediately, followed by a silence so complete it felt oppressive. Then, after what felt like several minutes, I heard a different sound, a soft scraping, as if something was being drawn across the wood of my door. It lasted for maybe 10 seconds, then stopped. When I finally opened the door, I found something that made my blood run cold. Scratched into the paint of my front door, in shaky but legible letters, was a single word: help. The scratches were fresh. I could see tiny curls of paint that had been scraped away still clinging to the wood. But there was no sign of what could have made them. No nail, no key, no tool of any kind was visible on the porch or in the surrounding area. I stood there staring at that word for a long time, my mind racing. If this really was Walter's spirit, what kind of help was he asking for? What could a living person possibly do for someone who had already passed away? The next day, I contacted the local historical society and the city records office, looking for any information about deaths or significant events in my neighborhood. What I discovered was disturbing. Walter Henning hadn't been the only person to die alone in the area. Over the past 20 years, 7 elderly residents within a 3-block radius had died of apparent natural causes while living by themselves. All had been found days or even weeks after their deaths, and several had shown signs that they'd been trying to reach their front doors when they collapsed. More troubling still, I found reports in the local newspaper's online archives of missing person cases, elderly residents who had simply vanished from their homes without a trace. The articles were brief and didn't suggest any foul play, but the pattern was unsettling. These weren't people in nursing homes or assisted living facilities. These were independent seniors who had simply disappeared from their own houses. I began to suspect that Walter's spirit wasn't just seeking help for himself, but trying to warn me about something that was still happening in the neighborhood. Perhaps he'd witnessed something before his death, or perhaps his spirit was aware of a danger that the living couldn't see. Determined to help however I could, I sought out a local medium named Sarah Chen, who had been recommended by several people online. Sarah was a middle-aged woman who ran a small metaphysical shop downtown, and she agreed to come to my house to try to make contact with Walter's spirit. On the night Sarah came over, we prepared carefully. She brought candles, sage for cleansing, and several crystals that she said would help facilitate communication with the spirit world. We sat in my living room as 11:30 approached, and she guided me through the process of opening myself to spiritual contact. When the knocking came that night, it was different. Instead of 3 measured raps, it was a frantic pounding, as if Walter was trying to warn us about something urgent. Sarah immediately began speaking to the spirit, asking questions and waiting for responses. What happened next was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. The temperature in the room dropped noticeably, and both Sarah and I could see our breath fogging in the suddenly frigid air. The knocking moved from the front door to the windows, circling the house in a pattern that seemed almost desperate. Through her spiritual communication methods, Sarah was able to piece together Walter's message. He had indeed been trying to warn people about something, someone who was targeting elderly residents in the neighborhood, someone who had visited him the night he died. He'd seen this person approaching other houses, watching and waiting for the right moment to strike. The knocking grew more intense as Sarah relayed this information, and suddenly Every door and window in my house began to rattle simultaneously. Books fell from shelves, picture frames tilted on the walls, and my dog, who had been hiding upstairs, began howling in a way I'd never heard before. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The temperature returned to normal, the rattling ceased, and a profound peace settled over the house. Sarah said she could feel Walter's presence retreating, as if a great weight had been lifted from his spirit. "He's at peace now," she told me. "He's been carrying this burden for years, trying to warn people, trying to protect the neighborhood. Now that someone finally listened and understood, he can move on." The next day, I took the information to the police. While they were initially skeptical, the pattern I documented was compelling enough that they agreed to investigate. Within a month, they had arrested a man who had been systematically targeting elderly residents, using their trust and vulnerability to gain access to their homes and steal from them. Several deaths that had been ruled natural causes were reopened for investigation. Walter's nightly visits stopped after that night with Sarah. The word help faded from my door over the following weeks, and my house returned to the peaceful home it had been before. But I'll never forget the persistence of a spirit who refused to rest until he could protect his neighbors one final time. Sometimes the dead have messages for the living, and sometimes those messages are more important than we could ever imagine. Walter Henning found a way to reach across the divide between life and death, to ensure that justice was served, and that others wouldn't suffer the fate that had befallen him and his neighbors. The knocking at my door had been a call for help, and I'm grateful that I finally learned to listen. My name is Raymond, and I live in Austin, Texas with my wife Carol and our 2 kids, Lucas and Sophia. I'm a simple guy. I work as an electrician for the city, come home tired most nights, and my idea of relaxation is settling into my recliner with a beer and whatever's on TV. I never imagined that my innocent evening routine would become the source of the most terrifying experience of my life. It was a Thursday night in September, and I just finished a particularly long day rewiring traffic signals downtown. The Texas heat had been brutal, even for someone used to working outdoors, and all I wanted was to get home to my family and unwind. Carol was in the kitchen making her famous chicken enchiladas, and I could hear Lucas and Sophia laughing in their shared bedroom as they played with their tablet. Our house is a modest ranch-style home in a quiet neighborhood near Lake Travis. We'd lived there for 6 years, ever since Lucas was born, and it had always felt like our safe haven from the chaos of the world. The living room was my domain in the evenings, a comfortable space with my worn leather recliner positioned perfectly in front of our 42-inch Samsung TV. I grabbed a Lone Star beer from the fridge, kissed Carol on the cheek as she stirred the enchilada sauce, and settled into my chair with the remote. It was around 8:30 when I started channel surfing, looking for something mindless to help me decompress. The kids would be in bed within the hour, and Carol and I were planning to watch a movie together. But for now, I just wanted some solo time with whatever ESPN or Discovery Channel had to offer. I was flipping through the channels when something on the screen caught my attention. At first, I thought it was just a problem with the cable signal. The image was fuzzy and distorted, like when a storm interferes with satellite reception. But as I watched, the static began to clear, revealing something that made my blood run cold. The screen was showing what appeared to be live footage of my own house. I could see our front yard, our driveway, even Carol's flower garden by the mailbox. The angle was wrong, though. It was as if the camera was positioned across the street and slightly elevated, giving a clear view of our entire property. What disturbed me most was that I could see our living room window, and through it, the faint glow of the very TV I was watching. My first thought was that someone had hacked into our security system, but we didn't have any exterior cameras. My second thought was that this had to be some kind of technical glitch. Maybe our TV was picking up a signal from a neighbor's security system. But as I continued watching, I realized that what I was seeing wasn't happening in real time. The footage showed events that hadn't occurred yet. I watched myself getting up from my chair and walking to the front door. I saw myself opening the door and stepping onto the porch, looking around as if I was searching for something. But I was still sitting in my recliner, remote in hand, staring at this impossible broadcast. Then the image shifted, showing the interior of our house from an angle that seemed to float through the rooms like a ghost. I saw Carol in the kitchen, but she was crying, her hands pressed to her face in obvious distress. I saw Lucas and Sophia huddled together in their bedroom, both looking frightened and confused. "Carol," I called out, my voice tight with anxiety. "Come here, you need to see this." She appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel. "What's wrong, honey? You look like you've seen a ghost." I pointed at the TV screen, but now it was showing a perfectly normal commercial for car insurance. The strange footage had vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving me feeling confused and shaken. The TV was showing. It was showing our house, and you were crying and the kids looked scared. I stammered, knowing how crazy I sounded. Carol looked at the screen, then at me with concern. "Raymond, it's just a commercial. Are you feeling okay? You've been working really hard lately. Maybe you're more tired than you thought." I tried to explain what I'd seen, but without the evidence on the screen, my words sounded like the ravings of an exhausted mind. Carol suggested I take a hot shower and get some rest, and part of me wanted to believe she was right. Maybe I had been hallucinating from fatigue and stress. But the next night, it happened again. This time, the mysterious broadcast began around 9 o'clock, just after I'd helped put the kids to bed. The screen flickered and distorted before revealing more footage of our house and neighborhood. I saw cars that I didn't recognize parked on our street, and people I'd never seen before walking past our house, stopping to peer into our windows. The most disturbing part was watching myself and my family in scenes that clearly hadn't happened yet. I saw Carol packing suitcases with frantic urgency while I loaded the kids into our car in the middle of the night. I saw police cars with flashing lights parked in our driveway. I saw our house with broken windows and the front door standing wide open. This time I called Carol immediately. When she came into the living room, the footage was still playing. Her face went white as she saw the images on the screen. "That's our house," she whispered. "That's our car. Raymond, what is this?" We watched together in horrified fascination as the scenes played out. The broadcast seemed to be showing us multiple possible futures, all of them involving danger and disruption to our peaceful life. We saw neighbors we recognized, but their faces were twisted with fear and suspicion. We saw emergency vehicles and news crews gathered on our street. The transmission cut out abruptly, leaving us staring at a blank screen. This time, no commercial took its place, just static and silence. "We need to call the police," Carol said, her voice shaking. "And tell them what? That our TV is showing us the future. They'll think we're crazy." But Carol was right about one thing. We needed help understanding what was happening. The next day, I contacted a local electronics expert who specialized in unusual signal interference. When I described the problem, he was skeptical, but agreed to come take a look at our TV and cable setup. Mike, the technician, spent 3 hours testing our equipment and found nothing unusual. Our TV was functioning normally, our cable connection was clean, and there was no evidence of outside interference or hacking. He did mention that our neighborhood had experienced some unusual electromagnetic readings lately, possibly related to solar activity, but nothing that should affect television reception. That night, Carol and I sat together in the living room, both of us tense, and watching the TV like it was a loaded weapon. The kids were asleep, and the house was quiet except for the hum of the air conditioning. At exactly 9:15, the screen began to flicker. This time, the images that appeared were even more specific and detailed. We saw a man approaching our house, tall, thin, wearing dark clothing and moving with obvious stealth. We watched him circle our property, testing windows and doors, clearly looking for a way inside. The timestamp in the corner of the strange broadcast showed a date 3 days in the future. But most terrifying of all, we saw ourselves and our children in what was clearly a life-threatening situation. The man had somehow gotten into our house, and we were trapped, unable to escape or call for help. The broadcast faded, leaving us sitting in stunned silence. "We're not waiting to see if this comes true," Carol said firmly. "We're taking the kids and staying at my sister's house until we figure this out." I agreed immediately. Whatever was causing these visions, technology, supernatural forces, or something else entirely, we couldn't risk the safety of our family. We packed bags that night and drove to Carol's sister's house in San Antonio, telling the kids it was an impromptu family visit. 3 days later, our neighbor called to tell us that our house had been broken into. The intruder matched the description of the man we'd seen on our TV, exactly: tall, thin, dressed in dark clothing. He'd been caught by our neighbor's security camera, and the police were investigating. We stayed away for 2 weeks while the police conducted their investigation and beefed up patrols in our neighborhood. When we finally returned home, the mysterious broadcasts had stopped. Our TV functioned normally, showing only the channels and programs it was supposed to show. The police never caught the would-be intruder, and we never got a satisfactory explanation for what had caused our television to show us those prophetic images. The electronics expert suggested it might have been some kind of quantum interference or temporal echo, but he admitted he was just guessing. What I do know is that those visions saved my family from what could have been a tragedy. Whether it was technology beyond our understanding, divine intervention, or something else entirely, we were given a warning that allowed us to protect ourselves. We still live in the same house, and I still settle into my recliner most evenings to watch TV. But now I'm always aware that the boundary between present and future might be thinner than we imagine, and that sometimes the most ordinary objects in our lives can become windows into possibilities we never expected to see. The experience changed all of us. We're more careful about home security, more aware of our surroundings, and more grateful for each peaceful day we're given. We learned that the future isn't fixed, that we have the power to change our destiny when we're given the knowledge to do so. And sometimes, late at night when I'm alone with the TV, I find myself watching carefully for any sign that the mysterious broadcasts might return. I'm not sure if I hope they will, or if I hope they won't, but I know that if they do, I'll be ready to listen to whatever warning they might bring. My name is Julia, and I want to share a story about something that happened to my family 3 years ago when we moved to Nashville, Tennessee. My husband Richard, our 5-year-old son Lucas, and I had just relocated from a small town in Kentucky, so Richard could take a position as a civil engineer with a major construction firm. We were excited about starting fresh in a bigger city, and we'd found what seemed like the perfect apartment in a beautiful historic building in the Green Hills neighborhood. Richard is the kind of man any woman would be lucky to have, dedicated, hardworking, and completely devoted to his family. He'd spent months interviewing for positions that would allow us to move somewhere with better opportunities for Lucas's education and our future. The job in Nashville was everything he'd hoped for, working on major infrastructure projects that would challenge him professionally while providing the financial stability we needed. Lucas was such a bright, energetic little boy at the time. He was obsessed with dinosaurs and had an impressive collection of books, toys, and models that we'd carefully packed for the move. He was naturally curious about everything and had this wonderful imagination that could turn any ordinary day into an adventure. He was a bit shy around new people at first, but once he warmed up, he was incredibly affectionate and talkative. The apartment we found was in a converted mansion that had been built in the 1920s. The building had been beautifully restored, maintaining its original charm while adding modern conveniences. Our unit was spacious and bright, with high ceilings, original hardwood floors, and large windows that let in plenty of natural light. Lucas was thrilled to have his own room for the first time, and we spent our first weekend setting it up exactly the way he wanted it. We painted his room in shades of green and brown to create a prehistoric forest theme, complete with dinosaur wall decals and a bed that looked like it belonged in Jurassic Park. Lucas helped us arrange his toy dinosaurs around the room, creating elaborate scenes and telling us stories about their adventures. He seemed to adjust to the new environment quickly, and we were relieved that the transition was going so smoothly. The first few weeks in Nashville were wonderful. Richard started his new job and was immediately impressed with his colleagues and the scope of the projects he'd be working on. I found a part-time position at a local marketing firm that allowed me to contribute to our income while still being available for Lucas. We enrolled Lucas in an excellent preschool program where he quickly made friends and impressed his teachers with his enthusiasm for learning. Everything seemed perfect until Lucas started talking about Johnny. It began casually enough. Lucas mentioned during dinner one night that he'd made a new friend named Johnny who lived in his room. Richard and I exchanged glances, but weren't particularly concerned. Many children Lucas's age have imaginary friends, and we figured it was his way of adjusting to the new environment and having his own space for the first time. "Tell us about Johnny," I said, encouraging him to share. What does he look like? Lucas described Johnny as a boy about his age, with dark hair and old-fashioned clothes. According to Lucas, Johnny knew lots of interesting stories and enjoyed playing with the dinosaur collection. It all sounded perfectly normal for a child's imagination. But as the days passed, Lucas's relationship with Johnny became more intense and detailed. He would spend hours in his room, and we could hear him having elaborate conversations with his invisible friend. Sometimes he would laugh delightedly. Other times he would speak in hushed, serious tones, as if discussing important secrets. What started to concern us was how realistic Johnny seemed to Lucas. Our son would set out snacks for Johnny, save him toys, and even ask us to be quiet because Johnny is sleeping. When we suggested that Johnny was just pretend, Lucas would become upset and insist that Johnny was real and that we just couldn't see him. The situation escalated when Lucas began having nightmares. He would wake up crying, saying that Johnny was sad or angry about something. When we tried to comfort him, Lucas would explain that Johnny was upset because we didn't believe in him or because something bad had happened to him long ago. Johnny showed me the fire, Lucas told us one morning after a particularly difficult night. He was scared and couldn't find his mommy. Richard and I were becoming increasingly worried about the intensity of these interactions. We consulted with Lucas's pediatrician, who assured us that imaginary friends were normal and usually temporary. She suggested we be patient and supportive, while gently encouraging Lucas to engage with real-world activities and friendships. But then Lucas started drawing pictures that made our blood run cold. The drawings showed stick figures of himself and Johnny, but they also depicted scenes that seemed far too sophisticated and disturbing for a 5-year-old's imagination. One drawing showed a building on fire with people at the windows. Another showed Johnny alone and crying, while adults ran away from something. The images were crude, but somehow captured a sense of genuine tragedy and fear. When we asked Lucas about the drawings, he said Johnny had shown him what happened before. He described events that sounded like historical disasters, fires, accidents, people being hurt or scared. The level of detail was unusual for a child his age, and the emotional content was deeply troubling. Our concern turned to alarm when Lucas's behavior began to change dramatically. He became withdrawn during the day, preferring to stay in his room with Johnny rather than play with his real toys or watch his favorite shows. His appetite decreased, and he seemed tired all the time, as if these interactions with his imaginary friend were draining his energy. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night when Lucas woke us up screaming. We found him sitting up in bed, pointing at the corner of his room and crying hysterically. "Johnny is angry," he sobbed. "He says you don't believe him. He says he's going to make you see." That's when we started hearing the sounds ourselves. At first, it was just subtle things, footsteps in Lucas's room when he was downstairs with us, toys moving around when no one was in there, doors that we'd left open being found closed. We told ourselves it was just the old building settling or Lucas moving things around when we weren't watching. But then we began experiencing things that couldn't be explained away. We heard a child's voice coming from Lucas's room when he was right beside us. We found handprints on his windows that were too small to be ours, but too high for Lucas to have made. Most disturbing of all, we began feeling a presence in the apartment, a sense that we were being watched by someone who wasn't quite friendly. The temperature in Lucas's room would drop suddenly and dramatically, even when the rest of the apartment was comfortable. We started finding toys arranged in patterns that Lucas swore he hadn't created. And sometimes we'd hear what sounded like two children playing together when Lucas was supposed to be napping alone. Richard, who had always been skeptical about supernatural phenomena, began to admit that something unusual was happening. One evening, he was reading Lucas a bedtime story when he distinctly heard another child's voice joining in, reciting parts of the story that Lucas didn't know. When Richard looked around the room, there was no one there except Lucas, who smiled and said, "Johnny knows that story too." The situation reached a crisis point when Lucas started displaying knowledge he couldn't possibly have acquired on his own. He began talking about events that had happened in the building decades before we moved in, describing people and situations with an accuracy that was impossible for a 5-year-old who had never been told these stories. "Johnny lived here when the big fire happened," Lucas told us one morning over breakfast. "His mommy couldn't find him because the smoke was too thick. He was hiding in the closet and couldn't get out." Alarmed by these specific references to a fire, I decided to research the history of our building. What I discovered at the Nashville Public Library made my hands shake as I read through the old newspaper archives. In 1947, there had indeed been a major fire in our building when it was still a private residence. The fire had started in the kitchen and spread rapidly through the old wooden structure. While most of the family had escaped, a 7-year-old boy named Jonathan Myers had become trapped in his bedroom on the 2nd floor, the same room that was now Lucas's. Jonathan's body had been found in the closet of that room, where he had apparently hidden from the smoke and flames. The newspaper articles described the family's frantic search for the boy and the tragic discovery of his body after the fire was extinguished. The detail that made me gasp was a quote from Jonathan's mother, who said her son had always been called Johnny by his family and friends. When I shared this information with Richard, we both knew we had to take action. Whatever was happening in our apartment was beyond normal childhood imagination, and it was clearly affecting Lucas's well-being. He had become pale and listless, spending most of his time in his room talking to Johnny instead of engaging with the real world. We decided to consult with someone who specialized in paranormal phenomena. Through a recommendation from a coworker, we contacted Dr. Margaret Reeves, a parapsychologist who had studied cases involving children and spirit contact. Dr. Reeves agreed to visit our apartment and assess the situation. When Dr. Reeves arrived on a Saturday afternoon, she spent time talking with Lucas about Johnny. What struck her immediately was the consistency and detail of Lucas's descriptions, as well as his genuine emotional connection to his invisible friend. She observed Lucas playing alone in his room, noting how he would pause as if listening to someone else speak and respond to questions that only he could hear. Children are often more sensitive to spiritual presences than adults, Dr. Reeves explained to Richard and me. It's possible that the spirit of the boy who died here has remained in this space, unable to move on. Your son's openness and innocence make him an ideal person for the spirit to connect with. Dr. Reeves conducted what she called a spiritual assessment of the apartment using various instruments to detect electromagnetic anomalies and temperature variations. She found significant disturbances in Lucas's room, particularly near the closet where Jonathan Myers had died. The spirit doesn't seem malevolent, she told us, but it's clearly stuck in this realm, possibly because of the traumatic nature of its death. It's drawn to your son because he represents the childhood and companionship it lost. The problem, Dr. Reeves explained, was that prolonged contact with an earthbound spirit could be draining for a living child. Lucas was essentially serving as a bridge between worlds, and that kind of spiritual connection was taking a toll on his physical and emotional health. She recommended a cleansing ritual designed to help Johnny's spirit find peace and move on to whatever comes after death. The ritual would acknowledge Johnny's presence, honor his memory, and gently guide him toward the light that would free him from his earthbound state. We scheduled the cleansing for the following weekend, giving us time to prepare Lucas for what would happen. We explained that we were going to help Johnny find his way home to his family in heaven, and that while Lucas would miss his friend, it was important for Johnny to be at peace. The night before the cleansing, Lucas had one final conversation with Johnny. We could hear him in his room, speaking softly and seriously, as if he was saying goodbye to a dear friend. When we checked on him, we found him sitting on his bed with tears in his eyes. Johnny is scared to go, Lucas told us. He doesn't want to be alone anymore. Tell Johnny that his mommy and daddy are waiting for him, I said gently. Tell him that he won't be alone, he'll be with people who love him. Dr. Reeves arrived on Sunday morning with candles, sage, and various spiritual tools. She had Lucas help with the ritual, explaining that his cooperation was important for helping Johnny feel safe about leaving. Together, they lit candles around the room and spoke words of comfort and farewell. As the ritual progressed, the temperature in the room began to fluctuate wildly. We heard what sounded like a child crying, and Lucas suddenly reached out as if he was hugging someone we couldn't see. He says thank you, Lucas whispered. He says he can see the light now. Then suddenly, the room filled with an overwhelming sense of peace. The oppressive feeling that had haunted the apartment for weeks lifted completely, replaced by a gentle warmth that felt like a loving embrace. Dr. Reeves smiled and nodded, indicating that the spirit had successfully crossed over. In the days that followed, Lucas returned to his normal, energetic self. He stopped spending long hours alone in his room and began engaging enthusiastically with his toys, his friends at school, and his family. His appetite returned, his color improved, and the nightmares stopped completely. Where did Johnny go? Lucas asked us a few days after the ritual. He went home to be with his family, Richard explained. He's happy now and he's not scared anymore. Lucas seemed satisfied with this explanation and never mentioned Johnny again. His room returned to being a normal child's space, filled with dinosaur toys and the sound of his own imaginative play. We lived in that apartment for another year without any unusual incidents. When we eventually moved to a house in the suburbs, it was simply because we wanted more space for our growing family, not because of any supernatural concerns. Looking back on that experience, I'm grateful that we were able to help both Lucas and Johnny find peace. While it was frightening at the time, I've come to believe that we were part of something beautiful, a lonely spirit finding companionship with a kind child, and ultimately finding the courage to move on to whatever awaited him. The experience taught our family that death isn't always a clean ending, and that sometimes those who have passed need help finding their way home. It also showed us the remarkable sensitivity and compassion that children can display when they encounter the supernatural world. Lucas is 8 years old now and has no memory of Johnny or the events in that apartment. But I believe that brief friendship with a spirit from another time taught him something valuable about kindness, empathy, and the importance of helping those who are lost find their way to safety. Sometimes the most frightening experiences in our lives turn out to be opportunities for healing and growth, both for the living and for those who have passed beyond the veil but not yet found their peace. It all started when my friend Marcus invited me to spend a long weekend at his family's country house in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. I'd been going through a rough patch at work. The consulting firm where I'd been employed for 3 years was going through layoffs, and the stress was getting to me. Marcus suggested that a few days away from the city would help me clear my head and recharge. The house was about 2 hours' drive from Washington, D.C., nestled in a remote valley, surrounded by dense forest and rolling hills. Marcus had inherited it from his grandfather the previous year, and he'd been using it as a weekend retreat when he needed to escape the pressures of his job as a patent attorney. He described it as the perfect place to disconnect from technology and reconnect with nature. I left D.C. on a Friday afternoon in early October, when the fall foliage was at its peak. The drive through the mountains was spectacular hillsides painted in brilliant reds, oranges, and golds, with winding roads that offered breathtaking vistas at every turn. By the time I reached the house, the stress of the past few months was already beginning to melt away. The house was exactly what I'd hoped for a rustic 2-story cabin built in the 1930s, with a wide wraparound porch, stone fireplace, and large windows that offered panoramic views of the surrounding wilderness. The interior was furnished with comfortable antiques and family heirlooms that gave it a warm, lived-in feeling. Marcus had stocked the kitchen with everything I'd need for my stay, and there was a stack of books by the fireplace that looked perfect for quiet evenings. Marcus had to leave early Saturday morning for a family obligation in Richmond, but he encouraged me to stay for the rest of the weekend and enjoy the solitude. The house has been in our family for generations, he told me as he packed his bag. My grandfather always said it was a place where you could truly be alone with your thoughts. You'll love it. After Marcus left, I spent Saturday exploring the property and the surrounding forest. The house sat on nearly 50 acres of wooded land, with hiking trails that led to a small lake and several scenic overlooks. The October weather was perfect, crisp and clear, with just enough chill to make the sunshine feel warming on my face. I took dozens of photos and felt more relaxed than I had in months. That evening, I made myself a simple dinner and settled in front of the fireplace with one of Marcus's books and a glass of wine. The silence was profound, no traffic, no sirens, no urban noise of any kind. Just the occasional sound of wind in the trees and the crackling of the fire. I read until late, finally heading upstairs to the guest bedroom around midnight, feeling more peaceful than I had in ages. The guest room was cozy and comfortable, with a queen-sized bed covered in handmade quilts and windows that looked out over the forest. I fell asleep quickly, lulled by the absolute quiet and the comfortable bed. I was awakened sometime in the middle of the night by the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside my room. At first, I thought I might be dreaming, but as I lay there listening, the footsteps continued slow, deliberate, and unmistakably real. They seemed to pace back and forth along the upstairs hallway, pausing occasionally before resuming their measured rhythm. My first thought was that Marcus had returned unexpectedly, perhaps because his plans had changed. But as I listened more carefully, something about the footsteps seemed wrong. They were too light, too careful, and they had an odd quality that I couldn't quite identify. I got out of bed and crept to the door, pressing my ear against the wood to listen more closely. The footsteps were definitely in the hallway, moving from one end to the other in a regular pattern. But when I quietly opened the door and peered out, the hallway was empty and dark. The footsteps stopped immediately when I opened the door, as if whoever was making them had noticed my presence. I stood there for several minutes, listening for any sound, but the house had returned to complete silence. Puzzled but not particularly alarmed, I went back to bed, assuming that the old house was just settling in ways I wasn't accustomed to. But the footsteps returned about an hour later, and this time they were more insistent. The sound was clearer, now definitely footsteps, not creaking wood or shifting foundations. Someone or something was walking back and forth in the upstairs hallway with purposeful determination. I got up again and checked the door, but once more the hallway was empty when I looked. This time, I decided to investigate more thoroughly. I grabbed my phone's flashlight and stepped into the hallway, examining every corner and checking the other bedrooms to make sure no one else was in the house. All the other rooms were empty and undisturbed. The windows were locked, and there was no sign that anyone had entered the house. But as soon as I returned to my room and got back into bed, the footsteps resumed. This pattern continued for the rest of the night. Every time I'd start to drift off to sleep, the pacing would begin again, always the same route, always the same measured cadence. And every time I investigated, I found nothing but empty hallways and locked doors. By morning, I was exhausted and thoroughly unsettled. The beautiful, peaceful retreat had become something far more mysterious and troubling. I made coffee and sat on the front porch, trying to make sense of what I'd experienced. In the bright morning sunlight, surrounded by the beautiful mountain scenery, the events of the night seemed almost dreamlike. I called Marcus to tell him about the footsteps, but he was tied up with his family and couldn't talk long. He seemed mildly concerned, but suggested that old houses often make strange sounds, especially at night when they're cooling down from the day's heat. He encouraged me to stay another night and promised we could discuss it more when he returned. I spent Sunday hiking and trying to tire myself out enough to sleep deeply. The physical activity and fresh air helped clear my mind, and by evening, I was ready to give the house another chance. Maybe Marcus was right. Maybe I'd just been hearing normal house sounds amplified by the unusual quiet. But Sunday night was even worse than Saturday. The footsteps began earlier this time, around 11 o'clock, and they were more aggressive. Instead of the measured pacing I'd heard before, the sounds suggested someone who was agitated or upset. The footsteps would start and stop abruptly, sometimes breaking into what sounded almost like running. I tried to ignore them at first, pulling pillows over my head and attempting to sleep through the disturbance. But then I began hearing other sounds, what sounded like doors opening and closing, drawers being pulled out, and objects being moved around. This time, when I investigated, I found evidence of the disturbance. Upstairs, closet doors that I was certain had been closed were now standing open. Furniture in the hallway had been shifted slightly, and there were what appeared to be wet footprints on the hardwood floor, though I couldn't determine what liquid might have made them. The temperature in the upstairs hallway was noticeably colder than the rest of the house, and there was a strange smell, not unpleasant, but musty and old, like clothes that had been stored in an attic for decades. As I stood in the hallway trying to process what I was seeing, I heard the footsteps again, but this time they seemed to be coming from downstairs. I followed the sound to the first floor, where I could hear someone moving around in the kitchen. When I reached the kitchen, I found the back door standing wide open, letting in the cold mountain air. I was certain I had locked that door before going to bed. As I approached to close it, I caught a glimpse of movement outside, a dark figure moving away from the house toward the forest. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the back porch, calling out, "Hello, is someone there?" But the figure had disappeared into the darkness of the trees, leaving me standing alone in the cold night air. I spent the rest of the night downstairs in the living room with all the lights on, jumping at every sound. By dawn, I had made the decision to pack up and leave. Whatever was happening in that house was beyond my ability to understand or cope with. As I was loading my car, I noticed an elderly man walking his dog along the dirt road that led to the house. I approached him and introduced myself, explaining that I'd been staying at Marcus's place. "Oh, you're staying at the old Henderson place," he said, nodding knowingly. "How did you sleep?" The question seemed oddly specific, so I told him about the footsteps and strange sounds. His expression grew serious. "That would be Thomas," he said matter-of-factly. "He's been walking those halls for nigh on 40 years now, ever since he died in that house back in '83. The old man, who introduced himself as Bill Crawford, had lived in the area his entire life. He told me that Thomas Henderson, Marcus's grandfather, had died alone in the house during a winter storm. He'd been found several days later by neighbors who came to check on him when they noticed his mail piling up. Thomas loved that house more than anything," Bill explained. "Spent his whole life there, raised his family there. I guess he just couldn't bear to leave, even after dying. Folks who stay overnight always report the same thing: footsteps in the hallway, doors opening and closing, cold spots. Nothing harmful, mind you. Thomas was a good man in life, and I reckon he still is in death. He's just still there." Bill told me that Marcus knew about his grandfather's lingering presence, but didn't like to talk about it with guests. "Some folks are bothered by it, others aren't," he said. "Thomas seems to sense which kind of person you are. If you're the type who can't handle sharing space with a ghost, he'll make sure you know he's there." I drove back to DC that morning with a completely different understanding of what I'd experienced. The fear and confusion were replaced by a strange sense of sadness for Thomas Henderson, a man so attached to his family home that death itself couldn't convince him to leave. When Marcus returned from Richmond, I told him what Bill Crawford had shared with me. Marcus was embarrassed and apologetic, admitting that he should have warned me about his grandfather's presence. "He was an amazing man," Marcus said. "The house was his whole world. He built most of the additions himself, tended the gardens, knew every tree on the property. I guess I understand why he'd want to stay. Marcus invited me to come back anytime, assuring me that his grandfather's ghost was completely harmless. He's actually quite protective of the place, Marcus said. Nothing bad ever happens there, no break-ins, no vandalism. It's like he's still watching over it. I've never returned to the house, though not because I'm afraid. The experience taught me that death doesn't always mean departure, and that some connections to places and people can transcend the physical world. Thomas Henderson found a way to remain in the place he loved most. And while his presence might be unsettling to visitors, there's something touching about his devotion to his family home. Sometimes love is so strong that it creates bonds that even death cannot break, anchoring souls to the places and people that gave their lives meaning. Thomas Henderson's footsteps still echo through that mountain house, a testament to the enduring power of home and the deep human need to belong somewhere completely. My name is Raphael, and I've been a fishing enthusiast my entire life. Growing up in Louisiana, I learned to fish in the bayous and swamps around New Orleans, and even after moving to Texas for work, I make it a point to explore new fishing spots whenever I get the chance. There's something about the solitude and patience required for fishing that helps me clear my mind and connect with nature in a way that nothing else can match. Last summer, I heard about a remote lake in East Texas from a fellow angler I met at a tackle shop in Houston. He described it as one of the best-kept secrets in the state. A pristine body of water surrounded by old-growth pine forest, completely undeveloped and rarely visited by tourists. The fishing, he claimed, was extraordinary, with largemouth bass, catfish, and crappie in abundance. It's called Whispering Lake, he told me, sketching a rough map on a napkin. About 3 hours northeast of here, way back in the Davy Crockett National Forest. You'll need a 4-wheel drive to get there, and there's no cell service. But if you want to catch fish like they used to catch 50 years ago, that's your spot. The idea of fishing in such an untouched location appealed to me immensely. I'd grown tired of crowded public lakes and pay-to-fish ponds, where you had to compete with dozens of other anglers for a good spot. The prospect of having an entire lake to myself, surrounded by pristine wilderness, was exactly what I needed after a stressful quarter at the oil services company, where I work as a geologist. I planned a long weekend trip for early September, when the summer heat would be starting to break, but the fish would still be active. I loaded my truck with camping gear, fishing equipment, and enough supplies for 3 days of solitude. The drive to the lake took me through increasingly remote countryside, past small towns that seemed frozen in time, and along back roads that grew narrower and more overgrown the farther I traveled. Finding the lake required following a series of unmarked logging roads deep into the national forest. The final approach was barely more than a dirt track winding through dense stands of pine and hardwood trees. When I finally emerged into the clearing where the lake was located, I felt like I'd discovered a hidden paradise. Whispering Lake was everything my fishing buddy had promised and more. The water was crystal clear, reflecting the canopy of trees that surrounded it like a natural cathedral. The lake was roughly oval-shaped, maybe 2 miles long and a mile wide, with several secluded coves and inlets that looked perfect for fishing. There was no sign of human development, No docks, no buildings, no trash left behind by previous visitors. I set up my campsite on a small rise overlooking the water, where I had a perfect view of the entire lake. The solitude was absolute. The only sounds were bird calls, the gentle lap of water against the shore, and the whisper of wind through the pine trees that gave the lake its name. The first day of fishing exceeded all my expectations. I caught more bass in 6 hours than I typically caught in a full weekend at more popular lakes. The fish were healthy, well-fed, and surprisingly large, suggesting that the lake's ecosystem was thriving without human interference. I released everything I caught, keeping only enough for dinner, and spent the evening by my campfire feeling more relaxed and content than I had in months. That night I slept better than I had in years, lulled by the natural sounds of the forest and the gentle movement of water. I woke before dawn feeling refreshed and eager for another day of exceptional fishing. The second day started just as well as the first. The morning bite was incredible, with fish practically jumping into my boat. I was anchored in a quiet cove on the far side of the lake, working a deep structure with a plastic worm, when I caught something that made my blood run cold. Instead of a fish, my line brought up what appeared to be a human hand. I nearly fell out of my boat when I saw it breach the surface. The hand was pale and waterlogged, with fingers that seemed to grasp at the air as it emerged from the depths. But as I looked more closely, I realized it wasn't attached to a body. It was just a hand, floating independently in the water. My first instinct was to cut my line and get away, but something kept me from moving. The hand didn't sink back down as I expected. Instead, it floated at the surface, and I could see other shapes beginning to emerge from the deeper water around my boat. More hands appeared, then arms, and finally entire figures that rose from the lake like something out of a nightmare. They were human in shape, but translucent, as if made of water and mist rather than flesh and bone. Their faces were indistinct, but I could see what appeared to be eyes, dark hollows, that seemed to look directly at me, with a mixture of sadness and desperate longing. I sat frozen in my boat, unable to process what I was seeing. The figures floated around me, reaching upward with movements that seemed both graceful and urgent. They appeared to be trying to communicate, their mouths opening and closing as if they were speaking. But all I could hear was a soft murmuring sound, like distant conversation. Then I noticed something that made the situation even more disturbing. The figures weren't random apparitions. They appeared to be people of different ages and from different time periods. Some wore clothing that looked modern, while others were dressed in styles that seemed decades or even centuries old. All of them shared the same ethereal, waterlogged appearance, and all of them seemed desperate to reach the surface. The realization hit me like a physical blow. These were the spirits of people who had drowned in the lake. As this understanding dawned on me, the murmuring grew louder and more distinct. I began to make out individual voices, some pleading, some warning, some simply calling out names of people who were no longer there to hear them. The sounds created a chorus of anguish that seemed to rise from the very depths of the lake. I grabbed my oars and began rowing frantically toward shore, but the spirits followed me, surrounding my boat like a ghostly escort. They didn't seem hostile, but their presence was overwhelming, filling me with a profound sense of sorrow and loss that wasn't my own. When I reached the shoreline, I dragged my boat onto the beach and ran to my campsite, my heart pounding and my hands shaking. The spirits remained in the water, but I could see them gathering near the shore, their forms becoming more distinct as the afternoon light faded. I tried to convince myself that I'd been hallucinating, that the isolation and perhaps some bad food had affected my perception. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen was real. The lake that had seemed so perfect and peaceful was actually a repository of tragedy, holding the spirits of those who had died in its waters. That evening, I hiked to the nearest point where I could get cell phone service and called my fishing buddy who had recommended the lake. When I described what I'd experienced, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "You saw them too, huh?" he finally said. "I was wondering if you would." He then told me the real story of Whispering Lake. The lake wasn't naturally formed. It had been created in the 1930s when a dam was built to flood a valley that contained a small town. The residents had been forced to relocate, but not everyone had left willingly. Some had refused to abandon their homes and had died when the valley was flooded. Over the decades since then, the lake had claimed additional victims. Hunters who fell through ice in winter, fishermen whose boats capsized in sudden storms, hikers who had accidents along the steep shores. The bodies of many of these victims were never recovered, lost in the deep water and dense vegetation of the flooded forest. The locals call it the Lake of Lost Souls, my friend explained. They say the spirits of everyone who died there are trapped in the water, unable to move on. Most people who fish there see them eventually, especially if they're alone and the conditions are right. He told me that he'd had his own encounter with the spirits years earlier, which was why he'd stopped going to the lake despite the excellent fishing. "They're not evil," he said, "but they're desperate. They've been trying to tell their stories, to make sure someone remembers them, but most people are too scared to listen." I spent a sleepless night at my campsite, watching the lake and occasionally seeing shapes moving beneath its surface. The murmuring continued throughout the night, rising and falling like a tide of whispered conversations. Sometimes I thought I could make out specific words or phrases, fragments of stories that the spirits were trying to share. The next morning, I packed up my gear and prepared to leave. But before departing, I did something that felt important. I stood at the water's edge and spoke to the spirits I knew were there. "I see you," I said to the lake. "I hear you, I won't forget." The water suddenly became still, and the murmuring stopped completely. For a moment, the lake looked exactly as it had when I first arrived, peaceful, beautiful, and seemingly empty. Then I saw them one more time, dozens of figures just beneath the surface, looking up at me with what I interpreted as gratitude. I've never returned to Whispering Lake, and I never will. But I've kept my promise to remember the spirits I encountered there. I've researched the history of the area and found records of the people who died when the valley was flooded, as well as documentation of the various drownings and accidents that have occurred since then. Each of those spirits was once a person with a name, a family, and a story. They became trapped in that beautiful, terrible place, unable to move on because they were forgotten, or because their deaths were never properly acknowledged. Sometimes the most beautiful places in nature hide the darkest secrets, and sometimes the price of solitude is encountering truths that we're not prepared to face. The Lake of Lost Souls taught me that even in death, people need to be remembered and honored. and that some mysteries are too heavy for one person to carry alone. My name is Jorge, and I've been working as a security guard in San Antonio, Texas, for over 12 years. I patrol various neighborhoods throughout the city on my motorcycle, making sure properties are secure and helping maintain safety in residential areas. After more than a decade in this job, I thought I'd seen everything: break-ins, domestic disputes, accidents, medical emergencies. But nothing in my experience had prepared me for what happened on a Friday night last October. I've always taken pride in my work as a security officer. It's not just about watching for criminals or vandals. It's about being a reassuring presence in the community, someone that residents can count on when they need help. I know most of the people on my regular routes, and they know me. There's a sense of trust and responsibility that comes with the job that I don't take lightly. The night everything changed started like any other. I began my shift at 10 o'clock, making my usual rounds through the neighborhoods I'm assigned to patrol. October in San Antonio can still be warm, but that night there was a cool front moving through, bringing the first real relief from the summer heat. The weather was actually pleasant for motorcycle patrol, with clear skies and a gentle breeze. Around 2:30 in the morning, I was patrolling a quiet residential area on the south side of the city when I heard something that made me slow down and listen more carefully. It was the sound of someone crying, not just ordinary tears, but deep, heartbroken sobbing that seemed to echo through the stillness of the night. At first, I thought it might be a domestic situation that required intervention. In my line of work, you learn to recognize the difference between normal household sounds and signs of distress that might indicate someone needs help. This crying was clearly the latter: raw, desperate, and full of genuine anguish. I followed the sound to a dead-end street lined with older homes from the 1950s. The houses were modest but well-maintained, and I'd patrolled this area hundreds of times without any significant incidents. The crying seemed to be coming from the backyard of a house at the end of the street, a small single-story home with a chain-link fence and an overgrown garden. I parked my motorcycle at the curb and approached on foot, using my flashlight to navigate carefully around the property. The house appeared to be vacant. There were no lights on, no cars in the driveway, and the grass looked like it hadn't been cut in weeks. But the crying was definitely coming from somewhere behind the house. When I reached the backyard gate, I could see a figure kneeling in the middle of the small yard. It was a woman with long, dark hair that fell around her shoulders like a curtain. She was wearing what appeared to be a white dress or nightgown, and her entire body was shaking with the force of her sobs. "Ma'am," I called out softly, not wanting to startle her. "Are you all right? Do you need help?" The crying stopped immediately, and the woman became perfectly still. I waited for her to acknowledge me or respond in some way, but she remained motionless, kneeling with her back to me. "Ma'am, I'm a security officer," I continued, speaking in the calm, reassuring tone I'd learned to use in crisis situations. "I heard you crying and wanted to make sure you're okay. Is there anything I can do to help?" Still no response. The silence that followed was somehow more disturbing than the crying had been. I opened the gate and stepped into the backyard, keeping my flashlight trained on the ground to avoid tripping while stealing glances at the kneeling woman. As I got closer, I could see that she was an older woman, probably in her 60s, with graying hair mixed in with the dark strands. Her dress appeared to be old-fashioned, with long sleeves and a high neckline that reminded me of clothing from decades past. She remained perfectly motionless, as if she was frozen in that position of grief. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to respond to me," I said, taking another step closer. "I'm here to help, but I need to know that you're okay." That's when she slowly began to turn around. What I saw when she faced me will haunt me for the rest of my life. Her face was pale and drawn, with deep lines of sorrow etched around her eyes and mouth. But it was her eyes themselves that nearly made me stumble backward in shock. They were completely black, not just the pupils, but the entire visible portion of her eyes, as if they were pools of infinite darkness. Those terrible eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Her mouth opened as if she was about to speak, but instead of words, the most agonizing wail I've ever heard came out. It was a sound of such profound loss and despair that it seemed to reach into my chest and squeeze my heart. I stood there paralyzed, unable to move or look away, as this impossible woman continued to stare at me with those black, lifeless eyes. The temperature around us seemed to drop 20 degrees in an instant, and I could see my breath forming clouds in the suddenly frigid air. Then, just as abruptly as she had turned to face me, she vanished. Not gradually, not by walking away or hiding behind something. She simply disappeared like smoke dissipating in the wind. One moment she was there, kneeling in the grass and staring at me with those horrifying eyes. And the next moment the backyard was empty, except for me and the sound of my own labored breathing. I stood there for several minutes, shining my flashlight around the yard and trying to process what had just happened. There was no sign that anyone had been there, no depression in the grass where she'd been kneeling, no footprints, no evidence that I'd just had an encounter with a human being. My hands were shaking as I made my way back to my motorcycle. Every instinct I had was telling me to leave that area immediately and never return. I'd always considered myself a rational, level-headed person, but what I just experienced challenged everything I thought I knew about reality. I drove straight back to the security company's dispatch office, where I found my supervisor, Maria, handling the night shift communications. She took one look at my face and knew something was seriously wrong. "Jorge, you look like you've seen a ghost," she said, then paused at her own words. "What happened out there?" I told her everything, the crying, the woman in the backyard, the way she'd vanished into thin air. Maria listened without interruption, her expression growing more serious as my story progressed. "The house on Elm Street?" she asked when I finished. "The small one at the end of the dead end." I nodded, surprised that she seemed to know exactly which property I was talking about. "That's the Ramirez house," Maria said quietly. "It's been empty for about 6 months, ever since Elena Ramirez died. Jorge, what you saw, it sounds like Elena." Maria then told me a story that made my encounter even more disturbing. Elena Ramirez had lived in that house for over 40 years with her husband Carlos and their only son, Miguel. The family had been happy and close-knit until tragedy struck 5 years earlier. Miguel, who was 28 at the time, had been driving home from work during a thunderstorm when he lost control of his car on a wet road. The accident also killed Carlos, who had been a passenger. Both men died instantly, leaving Elena alone with grief that consumed her completely. She never recovered from losing them, Maria explained. Neighbors said she would spend hours every night kneeling in her backyard, crying and talking to her husband and son as if they were still there. She stopped eating regularly, stopped taking care of herself, stopped connecting with the world around her. Alina had been found dead in her backyard 6 months earlier by a neighbor who hadn't seen her for several days. The cause of death was listed as heart failure, but everyone who knew her understood that she had really died of a broken heart. She was discovered kneeling in the exact spot where I had seen the apparition, wearing a white nightgown similar to what the figure had been wearing. The neighbors have been reporting strange things ever since she died, Maria continued. Crying sounds at night, glimpses of someone in white in the backyard, cold spots around the property. Most people assumed it was just their imagination, but what you described. That sounds exactly like Alina. The next day, I did some research of my own, visiting the local library and looking through newspaper archives and public records. I found Alina's obituary, which included a photo that confirmed my worst fears. The woman in the picture was unmistakably the same person I had encountered in the backyard. Though in life her eyes had been warm and kind rather than the black voids I had seen. I also found articles about the accident that killed her husband and son, including details about Alina's subsequent struggle with depression and isolation. The picture that emerged was of a woman who had been destroyed by loss, unable to accept that the people she loved most were gone forever. Over the following weeks, I found myself thinking about Alina constantly. The image of her kneeling in that backyard, consumed by grief that had literally killed her, filled me with a profound sadness. I began to understand that what I had witnessed wasn't just a ghost story. It was the manifestation of love so deep that it transcended death itself. I decided to return to the house, not as a security guard responding to a disturbance, but as someone who wanted to help a tortured soul find peace. I bought flowers, white roses, which seemed appropriate, and drove back to Elm Street during the day when the bright sunshine made the house look less ominous. I let myself into the backyard through the same gate I'd used on that frightening night. In the daylight, it was just an ordinary yard behind an empty house, with overgrown grass and neglected flower beds. But I could feel Alina's presence there, a lingering sadness that seemed to permeate the very air. I placed the flowers in the spot where I'd seen her kneeling and spoke to her as if she were standing right there. "Alina, I know you're here," I said quietly. "I know you're in pain, and I know you miss Carlos and Miguel terribly, but they're not here anymore, and you need to let them go. They wouldn't want you to spend eternity trapped by grief." I told her about the peace that awaited her, about the possibility of being reunited with her family in whatever comes after this life. I spoke about forgiveness, both for the circumstances of their deaths and for her own inability to move on while she was alive. As I talked, the temperature around me began to warm, and I felt a sense of lightness that hadn't been there before. When I finished speaking, I left the flowers and walked away, feeling like I had done something important, even if I wasn't sure what. I never saw Alina again, and the reports of strange activity around the house stopped completely after that day. Other security guards who patrol that area tell me the property feels normal now. Just another empty house waiting for new residents to bring it back to life. I still work the same routes, still patrol the same neighborhoods, But the experience with Alina changed how I think about my job and about life in general. I learned that some people carry pain so deep that it can anchor them to the physical world even after death, and that sometimes the living have a responsibility to help the dead find their way to peace. Alina taught me that love can be both the most beautiful and the most dangerous force in human experience. Her devotion to her family was so complete that losing them destroyed her. But it was also what kept her spirit trapped in that backyard, reliving her grief night after night. By acknowledging her pain and offering her a path to healing, I was able to help her break free from the cycle of sorrow that had bound her to that place. It's a responsibility I take seriously now, to be aware that the living and the dead sometimes share the same spaces, and that compassion can be a bridge between worlds. Every time I drive past that house now, I say a small prayer for Alina, Carlos, and Miguel, hoping that they've found each other again in whatever peaceful realm awaits us all when our earthly journey is complete. And I remember that sometimes being a protector means helping not just the living, but also those who have passed on but haven't yet found their way home. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.